Hey, happy Friday, everybody. I wanted to expand a little bit on what we talked about last week. One of the things we discussed was reinforcing exploration in your learner. And to preface this and to reiterate, um, great many of us know that behavior reduction, um, the reduction of maladaptive behaviors or whatever is contingent in most cases on skill acquisition, meaning, the more skills you can build up in a learner, especially around communication, but in other areas, the more you decrease problem behavior. And that's a huge thing. So a lot of the areas we focus on in ABA when we're writing up a treatment plan or we're in the classroom is on what skills can I give this learner in relation to the problem behaviors they are having. So things like an iPad, if a kid is tantrum for an iPad but doesn't have the word for the iPad, we're going to put some kind of maybe functional communication in, some kind of skill acquisition program like a mand or a point or a whatever, verbal mand, a vocal mand, to get them to ask for the thing they want, so if they can get it, and in turn we see the problem behavior go down. So that's something pretty cool. It's very dynamic, right? The issue at hand is there's a third thing. There's the reduction of maladaptive behaviors and reduction in tantrums. There's the increase in skills. Those are these two areas that are important. But also there's the fading of reinforcement, which is a very complicating thing, and I think it's very, very hard for people to do sometimes. And I think it's hard because we don't concentrate on it very much. So for the kid and the iPad, we give them the words for the iPad. What happens when the iPad's not available? What happens when the iPad dies? What happens when the favorite game is not on the iPad and things like that? And so, of course, we want to continue to build language around that. But the other thing is we want to guard against, we want to fade reinforcement, but we specifically want to guard against learners who are dependent on limited reinforcers like iPads and edibles and things like that. And the reason for that being is that if you're only dependent on 3 or 4 things, when those 3 or 4 things aren't available, you're very distraught. And the problem behaviors that we thought we took care of, the tantrums and things like that, the maladaptive behaviors that we thought we took care of, are still there when those reinforcers are gone. And it's unrealistic for us to expect that those reinforcers will always be around, right? And so what we have to do is we have to concentrate on skill acquisition. We have to concentrate on, the reduction of maladaptive behaviors and the relationship between those two things. But we also have to concentrate on looking at fading reinforcement, looking at, ensuring that the learner is not entirely dependent on a few reinforcers, that they have a diverse set of reinforcers. And so last week I talked about reinforcing preference exploration or reinforcer exploration, offering those high value reinforcers contingent on the learner pivoting away from them and engaging in exploratory behavior. If they're rifling through a toy box, for example, giving them back that iPad that they want, like getting them to pivot away from the high value to do some things, engage with some other things, and do some exploring. Maybe it's just touching other things, looking around at other things like that. But we have a skill area for that, bxmastery.com, if you want to look at that. But that was, we talked about reinforcer exploration. So the difference this week is I want to talk about also reinforcing or exposing learners and rewarding them for reinforcer experience, okay? And so we not only want to reinforce the behavior of going from one reinforcer to another reinforcer, or going from a reinforcer and immediately begin to scanning the environment and selecting or looking for another reinforcer. That's what we talked about last week, the reinforcing exploration. But we also want to get them familiar with as many toys, reinforcers in their environment that might give them some kind of joy, okay? And so we also want to reinforce their engagement with certain items and activities and everything. And we do not want to make this punitive in any way. We don't want to, we're pairing with them, but we want to make sure they get as many actions, much experience with the reinforcing nature of the toys in their environment. And so we have a bxmastery.com. We also have a skill area called single actions with common toys. Okay. And so it's a really important thing, to be able, like, every kiddo should at least know what each toy has the capability of doing. Whether or not they like that thing, that's fine. We're not going to make them play with it. But we do want to get to the point where they know and have an experience with most common toys, especially if they're little ones, right? So they have an experience with those common toys and they know what those toys do. Okay, so that way, if there is a reinforcing element of those toys, they know about it at least, and they'll return to it. So a lot of kids look at a pop-up toy and know kind of what to do with it. It's like, oh, let's explore it, let's move around, because again, we want to reinforce exploration, right? So they look at it, and then the next thing you know, they're like, well, that looks like a button. They start pushing it. Some of our kiddos don't know to do that. Their attention doesn't work the same way. And what's cool to them is not necessarily what other kids might think is cool. So we have to find a way to get them to that reinforcing element, that element that presents an interesting stimulus to them, or potentially presents an interesting stimulus to them. And so what we need to do is have them engage with all kinds of different toys and get to the point where at least once or twice they've engaged with them, maybe in exchange for another reinforcer, independently. So like if it is a pop-up toy, we present it to them perhaps, and we withhold maybe a couple goldfish, and they look it over and they press the couple buttons for a pop-up toy, and we give them the goldfish back. What we're trying to get is not to get them to play with it. Like, if they want to play with it, there will be a naturally derived motivation to play with it, and they won't need the goldfish necessarily. We want to get them to engage in the behavior that makes the toy potentially reinforcing to them, which is that pop-up, that stimulus of a pop-up. And they might be like, "Ooh, I really like that," Now, some kids, they'll do it a couple times independently and they'll be like, they're on. And if that's the case, we won't go back to it. We won't try. We just want to make sure that they know how to get to that stimulus. And so, in a particular skill area that we have on VX Mastery is shaking rattles, shaking tambourines, pop-up toys, the buttons, the fidget cues, those little bubble, those rubber bubble, they're like kind of like a bubble wrap thing. There's books they make for like pop up, the little bubbles that you push. Those things, I think I don't even have a name for them. Pushing a car on like a Hot Wheels track, using a slinky, bouncing a bouncy ball, getting them to throw a bouncy ball as hard as we can, tapping on a xylophone, engaging and squeezing, pinching kinetic sand. Again, these are all done not because we're like if we hold reinforcer contingent on a kid playing with this stuff or engaging with it, that doesn't mean they like it. We want just them to know how to engage with it so they can feel the potential reinforcing effects of that particular toy. So that way, if the iPad dies and they're in the playroom, they're in a spot where like, okay, I have a couple toys I have a history with, and I have a couple toys in here that I know how to work. And oh wow, look, there's those rubbery worms, and I want to swing them around and pull on them and everything like that. And it's because we put them in a spot where they know that those things are reinforcing and whatnot. And so that's the point of today's essentially today's video is where last week we talked about getting them to pivot away and just kind of go and look around and explore and touch and things like that. We also want to get them to have a history of experience with each of these, very, elementary toys, because what that does is it puts them in a spot where they know what it does. They've experienced the reinforcing properties of the toy potentially. And if one of them kind of turns their crank, a couple of these toys they kind of dig, in a situation, they have a history there and they kind of know where to go. So that's a big thing. So again, we do concentrate on skill acquisition. We do concentrate on, reduction of maladaptive behaviors, but we have to construct more opportunities for reinforcement and experiences with reinforcement. And that's what this does. So get at me with questions. Thanks so much, guys. Very receptive to our last article. I really appreciate it. Share with your friends and get this out there. Any comments, questions, reach out.